Thank you everyone for joining us for the second series for Thinking Forward. Today we'll be talking about inequity and sort of what that means currently and also into the future. So my name is Simon, I'm the career advisor and educator. Also have Jim Kelly with me, who is a Vic student in her fourth year. This semester is the last semester, and she'll be helping us with co-moderating our discussion with Roni today, who is the alumni. So before we start, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement of where Vic is at. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And particularly important for today's discussion, when we're talking about rising inequity, when we talk about histories of oppression, systemic discrimination that has been taking place for centuries in this country and continues to operate today. So thinking about how we can use our privilege, being privileged to be able to attend U of T, to be part of the U of T and the community, how can we use that privilege to be able to support and help and support the Indigenous peoples to be able to claim their land and to be able to have authority and power over the land that they were originally on. So something to think about also for currently and also for the future when we think about our own careers as well. In terms of accessibility, we have live transcript. So turn on the live transcript on Zoom, so you might see some words on the bottom. Hopefully they're mostly accurate, but as with all transcriptions, they may not be at times. If there are ways to make this panel more accessible, please let me know either through the chat or you can also enter your thoughts on the evaluation. And there's only really just one slide for this part. So in case you're wondering, there's not going to be much content. It's really just about us having a conversation with Roni today. So just to sort of set the stage in terms of the content, sort of what kind of things we may be talking about, just so we're on the same page. When we talk about rising inequity, when we think about last year, the rise of Black Lives Matter, recently the Me Too movement, other social movements, and how these have really increased awareness of different social issues, also with anti-Indigenous racism, and all these things have been really prevalent, especially last year, and with sort of what's happening down in the States and sort of the transition from Trump to Biden, and that sort of has emerged a lot of different social awareness and social movements as well. When we look at the pandemic of COVID-19, the unequal impact of COVID-19 in terms of how it has sort of unequally impacted vulnerable and marginalized populations. So thinking about those who may be in neighborhoods that have less income, and that can result in those individuals being more at a higher risk of getting COVID-19. And then when we think about vaccine distribution, how is the vaccine being distributed? Is it equal? Is it not equal? And thinking about who has access and who doesn't have access to vaccines. We're also seeing continued disparities with privileged groups and marginalized groups. So it's a gap that has been increasing every single year, and thinking how can we look at reducing that gap and decreasing that gap so that we have more equitable ways for people to access resources. And also, when we look at different organizations, industries, and sectors, there's an increased focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So you may have noticed if you're looking at job postings, so there's a lot of positions for EDI positions, so managers, advisors, consultants, especially when we look at the university space, that's been really prominent. So we're looking at an increased focus and more awareness that companies need to be more focused on equity and diversity, both internally, but also externally to their communities that they work in. All right. So I stop my screen share. So the primary focus today is speaking with Roni, who is our alumni. So she is a Vic alumni from 2001. She's a senior advisor at the BMO Financial Group, where she's currently focused on social sustainability. And we're grateful to have her here to learn from her knowledge, her wisdom, and her expertise. So for this session, the format's going to be sort of Jim Kelly will be having a structured Q&A with Roni for about the first 25, 30 minutes. And then we'll open up the floor to all your questions for the latter half hour. So let Jim Kelly start. I will say, so we are hoping to get a screenshot of it comfortable for sort of social media purposes on LinkedIn. So when you would like to sort of promote the event. So I'll probably take a picture, a screenshot over the next minute or two. So if you feel comfortable having your image promoted on LinkedIn, feel free to keep your camera on. If you don't want to have your image shared on LinkedIn, feel free to turn it off for the next minute and then turn it back on afterwards, okay? But I'll leave it to Jim Kelly and she can lead the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Simon. Roni, thank you again for joining us. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is to introduce yourself. I know Simon gave you an introduction, but maybe we can hear about you from your own words a bit.
Sure. So Rani Puran, and as Simon mentioned, I am a Vic alumni. So I was at Vic, about 20 years ago in the late 90s and graduated in 2001 and have really fond memories of my time there. I lived in Ansley Hall for all of my undergrad and, have a couple of friends from that residence that I'm still very close to. Two in particular, so love the university and always pleased to talk to alumni to explore, career possibilities that you may not necessarily have thought about when you're in school. In terms of my job, so currently I'm with BMO and I advise the bank on, oh, that's wonderful, lived in Ansley. I advise the bank on social sustainability topics. A core component of that is diversity and inclusion. So prior to having this role in social sustainability, I was actually focused only on diversity and inclusion. And what you'll find, and you probably read about in the news and you'll hear more about, over the coming decades, is an increasing stakeholder focus on the importance of diversity and inclusion. So in the past couple of years, we've seen investors, so like big pension funds, for instance, asset management companies, want to know what companies are doing to address issues of D&I in the workplace and on their boards and senior leadership levels. So that's the distinction between social sustainability and D&I. When we talk about D&I, we tend to think about it in the context of employees only. When we think about social sustainability, D&I is one component and there's a different stakeholder perspective to it. It also involves looking at related issues like human rights. So I've led a project for the bank on that. And then a topic that I studied recently, which is about diversity as we transition to a net zero carbon economy, which is a just transition. And perhaps we'll have time to explore that a bit today. So I'll stop there, Kelly, in terms of the intro.
All right, that was great. You mentioned social sustainability, diversity and inclusion. So our first question is actually related to that. How do you think social movements that we've seen in the past and that are continuing, like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, will affect how organizations and people work?
Yeah, great question. So we are seeing a sea change in the way organizations think about and action diversity and inclusion. So if I throw my mind back to 2017, when I took on this 100% D&I role, we didn't really have attention on Black Lives Matter. Me Too, there was some talk about it, but not a lot. So there was this very strong employee focus, like what does our workforce look like in terms of diverse groups, be that ethnic minorities, women, Indigenous peoples here in Canada, also in the US, persons with disabilities and so forth, right? And then this year we have COVID-19, as Simon highlighted. We've seen, disproportionate adverse impacts on vulnerable groups. We have this global sweep of Black Lives Matter with the killing of George Floyd. Me Too gets momentum over the coming years. And all of a sudden, the conversation in organizations has changed around diversity and inclusion. So there is this creeping in, if you like, of kind of social justice talk. And we need to do this because it's the right thing to do. It's no longer good enough that people are being treated like this in society, right? We have to confront intergenerational trauma. We have to look at the legacy of slavery. We must do more around truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So in addition to this focus on looking at what is your representation of these groups in the workforce, you now have a broader perspective on what diversity and inclusion means to society. And so the three impacts I have seen in organizations that have been taken up very quickly. So the first is a strong appetite to have uncomfortable conversations. So people continue, and this is natural. This is to a great extent how we're wired as human beings, and we need help with this. So people have different comfort levels with empathy, with vulnerability, with being able to talk about dimensions of difference, particularly race, and being Canadians, we tend to be very politically correct. We're not as direct. And so what we found is a strong appetite to have uncomfortable conversations. And I'll talk about race because of Black Lives Matter and reconciliation in Canada with Indigenous peoples, but caution around how you do that. So for instance, at BMO, what we did is when there was this surge of interest after George Floyd died, we consulted with what we call enterprise resource groups at the bank, which some people may be familiar with, and that's for employees who identify from a particular diverse group and or people who want to be allies to marginalized groups to join in a community and work on creating a culture of inclusion and engagement. So we consulted with the Black Professionals Network to get their perspective based on lived experiences if we wanted to run out an education program that was talking to 40,000 employees across the world about why it's important to understand systemic discrimination, to explore white privilege. How do we do that? So that's the first thing, having these uncomfortable conversations. The second is no longer just looking at the representation of diverse employees at lower levels in the organization, but looking at it at the highest level. So historically, there's been a focus on looking at women in senior leadership, and all the other groups we looked at across the levels of the organization. Now we look at Indigenous peoples, BIPOC, Black Indigenous people of color at senior levels. So that's the other change. And then the third change we've seen, which I mentioned earlier, is we're no longer just looking at employees, but we're looking at what can we do in our communities. So it's corporate donations is a big part of it, but it's also about how are our products and our services at the bank serving communities. So what can we do to make loans in the form of mortgages or capital for businesses that may be owned by individuals who self-identify as Black or Indigenous people or women? How can we make more resources available to them?
Okay, that was a really great answer. I really picked up on some of the things you said from your 3 points that relate to BMO and the workplace. So I'm thinking, stemming from those 3 points, uncomfortable conversations, how can the workplace influence the community, and looking at the levels of organization, how can students think about making an impact and leading diversity and equity initiatives in their current and future workplaces from now?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another great question. So the biggest opportunity for impact that students have, particularly early on in their careers, is to be an ally. And to be an ally both as a person who identifies as coming from a diverse group, and to be an ally if you don't identify as coming from a diverse, if you're a straight, white, able-bodied man, you can still be an ally, and that's very important. And why this is so important, and I think is the biggest opportunity, is because if you're going to have uncomfortable conversations in the workplace, there needs to be psychological safety. There needs to be trust. Employees need to feel supported, and they need to know that there are people there that will allow them to talk about how they're feeling. And there's been some research has been done by an organization called Catalyst, which is a global organization, focuses primarily on gender research, and has started to do some interesting research around intersectionality. And they have come up with this concept known as emotional tax. And they look at what emotional tax do diverse employees bear. And what this essentially means is if you identify as coming from a group that's not dominant in society, so it could be because of socioeconomic status, it could be because of skin color, it could be because of disability, whatever, an Indigenous person, age even, right? We don't often talk about age, but that is a dimension of difference. You are on guard, so to speak, because you walk around with this fear that because of your difference, you're going to be discriminated against. You're going to be treated differently. People don't understand you necessarily. I mean, and this is something often our LGBT plus employees will talk about. And so it is important to understand the impacts of that. When you have employees that are on guard, they are more likely to leave organizations. There's data on this. but they also want to be high performing and they want to be accepted. So when you enter the workforce, how can you become a good ally? You can join an employee resource group. You can mentor someone. You can talk about your experience. Okay, these are all very simple ways to help build a culture of trust within an organization.
Thank you. That kind of leads also into our next question. So what other skills, you did mention being able to build that culture of trust, but what other skills do you think students can develop and learn, especially now at school, to better adjust to the future trends that we're seeing?
Okay, so a couple of points for consideration here. So let's talk about soft skills first, or what we typically call soft skills. So I mentioned the ability to be empathetic, the ability to be vulnerable, to know how to create a feeling of psychological safety so employees can feel included. That is going to continue to be critical as organizations want to understand how they can create diverse and inclusive workplaces for employees. And employees should demand this, in my opinion. We spend so much of our time at work, and now with working from home, there's this bleeding of the workday and your personal life. So critical. Now, everyone's born and through their life experience, their socialization, their family of origin, with a different proclivity, if you like, towards being able to be vulnerable, towards being able to be empathetic. But these are skills that can be learned. And I see them as part of leadership development. So when you think about yourself as a leader and the type of leader that you want to be, related to empathy and being able to be vulnerable is self-awareness. So I strongly encourage students to think about how are you developing these capabilities within yourself. This is so critical for you as a leader, and there are many ways to do that. Related to this as well, I think it's extremely important to understand where your own biases are, right? So the most common example that we hear is you're walking down the street and you might see a person who's Black, a male in particular. He has a hoodie, it's so stereotypical. And what do people do? They cross the street, they fidget. Or you see an Indigenous person, he looks like he might be inebriated. What do? You cross the street, right? There's no basis in reality for this kind of behavior, but it is so hardwired into us because of the inequity in the system. So we have to do that personal work to understand where our own biases are. It's personal work, but it's depersonalizing it, because it's also understanding that this doesn't make me a bad person, but it shows them part of a larger way of thinking about which I may not have been aware. So this is a critical dimension of leadership development. In terms of technical skills, investment in data and analytics is extremely important. It's core to doing diversity and inclusion work. It's core to doing social sustainability work. So if we think about the areas that are really hot right now, that you read a lot about in the news, climate change, right? The transition to a net zero carbon economy, artificial intelligence, diversity and inclusion, they are all underpinned by being able to work with data and have strong analytical skills. So this is something you get in university. Your tertiary education gives you that, and is something that should be developed, definitely. And then the third skill I would flag, I don't know if it'll be surprising or not, is the ability to manage your money. And while you may not think of it as directly related to your job, the reason I say this is because we don't know what the economic fallout of the pandemic is going to be. We're not going to know this for at least another couple of months. We won't know this until the pandemic has ended. It's like an earthquake. The shaking has to stop before we can see the extent of the damage. And unfortunately, what we read about there not being clear enough policy direction around protections for workers, movements towards more of a gig economy and unstable work, and how new graduates may be impacted by that, may all be very true. And so it's really important that you have responsibility over your finances, that you understand money, you know how to manage it, so you can prepare yourself for this period of uncertainty and instability that we don't know how long it may be around for.
Thank you. Thank you. Rani, I just have one more question for you. So when we've thought about social movements, we've thought about how students can build skills to lead and support diversity, inclusion in the future, and equity. So when you think about the future of work and your industry, what things excite you?
Yeah, so the future of work and my industry. So I'll talk about the future of work first, okay? And maybe start off with COVID-19. So it's difficult to predict what the future of work will look like as a result of COVID-19. It's just too early to tell. There was so much enthusiasm, and Tim Kelly, you and I were talking about this in the beginning about the relief of not having to commute, right? So many people, especially in financial services, when they work in the financial district or on Bay Street, feel that they're coming in from Oakville or Whitby and so forth. But now we're hearing people are really fatigued. Not that they want to go back to commuting. I haven't heard anyone say they want to go back to commuting, but people are fatigued by this online experience. They want social interaction. They want flexibility. So we do know that there is going to be more workplace flexibility. And this is going to open up the marketplace for talent globally, for sure. And so I think that's a trend that will increase, that we've read about in the news, and that we can say with a high degree of certainty that will continue. The other component of the future of work is artificial intelligence. And so we read about, and I've seen at the bank, artificial intelligence being used in a number of ways. It's being used in human resources with respect to trying to eliminate bias, right? And this is a controversial area in terms of hiring, right? Can we overcome bias that individuals may be predisposed to by using algorithms? It's being used to address cybersecurity issues. It's being used to help develop products, financial services products for consumers. Okay, so there are a range of ways artificial intelligence is being deployed. So that excites me as well, because that can really transform companies and industries' business models. And then the third area that really excites me, which is like at this really macro level, which is related to what I studied and has an equity focus, is the transition we're going to make to a net zero carbon economy. And too often, particularly in Canada, because of our natural resources-based economy and the concentration of oil and gas in Western Canada, we have a slightly negative vision of this transition to a net zero carbon economy and what is the economic impact going to be. And there's actually a very positive picture to be painted about this, which countries in Europe are doing a much better job of. And the US under Biden administration has already started painting a very positive picture for. And so the point I want to leave you with here, as it relates to the future of work, is in the transition to a net zero carbon economy, industries are going to contract, industries are going to grow. Extractive industries are going to see job losses. There's no doubt about that. Petroleum extraction, refining, oil needs to stay in the ground. But there are a whole host of industries that are going to experience growth: renewables, clean technology, utilities, transportation, manufacturing. And the International Labour Organization has actually said globally there will be a net increase of 18 million jobs as a result of the transition. So what this tells you is that there's a reskilling opportunity. So there's going to be an offset between the jobs that are lost and the jobs that are created, and you need to reskill people for these. And so this is a massive opportunity for us to address inequity, because all the industries I mentioned, those that are going to decline and those that are going to grow, are underrepresented when it comes to women, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities. It's a larger conversation to talk about the socioeconomic dimension, but we do find younger white men that are not recipients of tertiary education will be disproportionately impacted by the loss of jobs in petroleum extraction and refining. This has already started happening. That is not a group we think of as an equity-seeking group traditionally, but is an important group to consider when we think about the transition. So that really excites me, because it is an opportunity to really raise the bar on equity and think about how we can give groups access in this societal transformation that's going to happen.
Thank you, Rani, for answering my questions. All of your answers were just great. I have so many things to think about and so many notes, and I'm sure the other students do too. I think Simon's gonna take it over now and take Q&A questions.
Yeah,
Any of you guys have?
So for the students here, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. We can put them in the chat. There was a lot there that Roni mentioned, and it was just, I will say my part of my mind just sort of exploded because there's just so much great information there. But maybe I'll ask one question and then feel free for the students to jump in. Or if you have something right now, feel free to mute yourself and then I'll take that as a cue that you want to ask your question. One thing that I'm curious about is the role of language, because at the university, the certain languages or certain terms that we use here that sort of is spoken about in classroom, but acknowledging that the language that is used in different industries and different sectors can be very different. Even like within the university, the language that we use in one faculty to another faculty can be slightly different. So how do you see the role of language in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion? How does that play a factor when students sort of engage in the workforce?
Right. Language is important because it's personal to people. So for instance, in the corporate sector, the term that's recently been adopted is BIPOC this year, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And we had a lot of discussions. So BMO, it's a global bank, but its biggest operations are in the US, outside of Canada. We had a lot of discussions about the term BIPOC because the Americans liked it more than the Canadians. Now, one of the reasons the Americans liked it more than the Canadians is because in the US, for instance, people of color includes Indigenous peoples. So when employees in the US get a survey to fill out where they self-identify on a number of factors, if they're an Indigenous person, that option is under people of color. In Canada, it's not. Indigenous people is a separate group. So those sorts of nuances are very important. Within Canada, for instance, we've had discussions about the term racialized minorities versus visible minorities. Now, a lot of visible minorities have shared with us that they don't like the term visible minorities because very soon, and we already know this is the case for Vancouver, for instance, I don't know what the latest census data is on the GTA, but it's likely very similar, that like the GVA is predominantly not Caucasian. So the term visible and visible minority is not relevant anymore. And, you know, we're in touch at the bank with regulators, and the regulators say the Canadian Employment Equity Act is out of date. It doesn't use terminology that reflects the makeup of Canada in 2021. So that's important to keep in mind too, because we have certain requirements as a bank to use the terminology that's in legislation, but it doesn't always fit well with people. So that's another nuance. You know, universities, I've heard they use the term racialized minorities. We don't like the term racialized minorities in the bank. We prefer people of color. I personally don't like people of color, but that's what's used. So, you know, there are many factors at play here. And I would say what is important is not to make assumptions when people use certain language, but is to be curious about what that might be about. In the UK, for instance, ethnic minorities are referred to as BAME. Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. Not a very popular acronym at all.
Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. We talk about academia, like we're having academic discussions on our language and go really in depth, but also recognizing like, what is the actual impact on people. And there's never going to be the one term that everyone agrees with. So acknowledging sort of, I love that comment of like not having assume what people mean by a language and sort of have that open curiosity and be open to what people identify with. Any questions from any of the students, or I'll even take like half thoughts of things that are something percolating in your mind that you sort of want to sort of just openly discuss. I'm sure that would be very fruitful as well.
Yeah, so thank you so much for everything you've already shared with us. This is kind of a like specific question, but in terms of like, I suppose in the workplace or even in the classroom, well, okay, my original phrasing of this question was more for like in the workplace. So say we're in the workplace and we see that either we as like racialized people are being paid less or our coworkers are being paid less. How do we both advocate for ourselves and how do we advocate for our coworkers?
Okay, great, timely question. I have a question for you.
Yes.
Angelique, how do you imagine you would know as a minority you're being paid less?
I would imagine that I would have to have a conversation with a coworker, like have to be comfortable enough bringing it up? I know like money is a touchy subject, especially for myself. So yeah, first of all, I guess like how would you initiate that conversation with your coworkers? Like, hey, how much are you being paid? It's kind of a weird conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of thoughts here, and feel free to chip in, because this is so relevant, right? Like I came across an article in the US that talked about, I don't remember if it was Black or Hispanic Latino women, or if it was both combined. But basically, the article I read said they earn like 62 cents to every dollar compared to a white man.
I read that same article.
Right? So the data is there. It's out there. That there's this strong trend that minorities, and then minorities, so you're talking about I'm talking about intersectionality here, minority women earn less. But it's very difficult to find out in the workplace, particularly in the corporate sector, where you as an individual stand. So my experience, I've been working for 15 years now. Prior to the bank, I was in professional services. We don't talk about salaries with each other. Now, what you can do, and you're certainly empowered to do this, and companies will make this available, though it's not always easy to find, is you can find the salary bands for your grade in an organization. And typically, the organizations I've worked for, which are large global organizations, have a pay philosophy. And their pay philosophy goes something like, we strive to pay employees towards the midpoint of the band. So once you find that band, I mean, you can certainly ask employees who've been there longer when you join an organization, oh, where can I find the salary ranges? Then you can assess where you are in the band. And you can use that as a starting point for a discussion. You can say, hey, actually, the pay philosophy of the organization says we pay to the midpoint, but I'm below the midpoint. Well, what happens if you're above the midpoint? I know there have been experiences of minorities that have been above the midpoint and haven't seen salary increases for several years. And they've been told, you know, you're above the midpoint, yet the organization may have a pay for performance philosophy. So it's kind of like a little bit like a black box. You can get some information, but I haven't found employees comfortable to share what they're earning. Your friends might, but I don't know about your friends at work. You know, one's friends at work, how comfortable they feel. But the salary band is important. So I would say, you know, your 2 data points are the salary band, and then, you know, what you're reading, and then make some sort of assessment about, you know, whether you think you're being paid equitably or not. This is a very important topic. Like there are indices, so things called like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index, where organizations are ranked based on various factors or indicators, if you like. Pay equity, particularly gender pay equity, and some of them go further and look at ethnic minority pay equity, is a question that's asked in there, and companies have to provide data. And so investors use these indices to determine if they're going to hold particular companies or how sustainable they think companies are. So it is a topic that is important and will continue to grow in importance. Hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. And some other, like, I guess, points of data in case you're not, in case you want to go work elsewhere. Universities tend to have the pay bands publicly available. So unions generally, if you find their handbook, the agreements, everything is sort of laid out really transparently. So at the very least, if you're not really sure what you should be getting paid, having that information can at least tell you minimally I should be getting paid at least this amount given this kind of job, which is similar to that organization or that company. So
good point.
Yeah, great question.
So my question might be a little bit personal, but diversity and inclusion work is very important, but it can also be deeply personal. How do you, besides like employing professionalism, kind of like maintain sort of like an even balance between like the personal drive behind it, but also the work that needs to be done and including everyone in it as well?
Tough question. So to make sure I'm answering it, so are you asking me how I manage what my personal motivators might be for working in this area with my accountabilities at work, which may require professionalism, and sort of the journey that that involves and how I balance it.
More like how this can be deeply personal, but
Okay.
yet maintaining the professional aspect of it and not allowing it to delve too personal.
Yeah, too personal. Okay. With D&I work, everyone I know who works in diversity, including myself, identifies with at least one dimension of difference. I identify as a woman of color, and as a woman who has a disability. It's a non-physical disability. It's related to a health condition, which is fairly recent. I would say there's not one person on the team. So it is personal. It's very personal. You also get people that come to the work because it's a very intellectually challenging area. Like, you need to think about organizational dynamics. You need to understand sociology, politics, business strategy. So it's got that as well. So what I'm saying is, you get people that are highly motivated because of their lived experience, and then very committed to results. And what I find is this can lead to fatigue, because there's this professionalization of this work, which is you create a function in an organization that is supposed to make progress on diversity and inclusion. But actually, you can't make progress on diversity and inclusion unless your leadership and your employees in the bank, who aren't in the D&I function, right, adopt this. So one of the biggest challenges I see related to the impact, because it's such personal work, is fatigue. And you really need to understand, I've done a lot of work myself on this, with how you build resilience and where you might get triggered because of this work. For me, it's particularly around age and gender. Those are my triggers. And so I do a lot of internal work and think about having good support in terms of coaching from my boss or peers when I hit problematic areas, to maintain my professionalism. The other point I would make is, and this is from personal experience, you know, the legal standard for discrimination is very high. You know, to prove that you've been discriminated against legally is high. But we all know discrimination happens in very subtle ways, day to day. This is where this concept of emotional tax comes in as well. And it wears individuals down. And if you have that experience, that makes the work very personal as well. And that certainly sustains me to continue doing the work.
Cool. Thank you. Great question, especially I think for a lot of students, like at university, in many places, like oftentimes I think universities consult a lot with students for their experiences and for their expertise, and it can be a lot to sort of ask from people. Like, they always ask the same people for advice, or always ask the same people for consultations, and that can be very taxing than having the emotional tax. So it's great to sort of find ways to sort of balance that out and not always be sort of on it all the time. Because sometimes we just need to sort of relax and not think about the world at times. So Ralph, I noticed that you're unmuted, so I'm going to assume that you have a question.
Yes. Hi. This is more of a personal question for you. What in terms of why you decided to take, or I guess your educational trajectory on why you decided to take a master's in information studies, and how much education did you receive on the job, like in your,
Okay, great question. Okay, so the first part, why did I decide to do a degree in information studies? Prior to that master's, I had completed a master's in international and European politics. And so politics and policy is like my first love. And I think it's so important to understand what is happening in the world, because that impacts what business does. Sometimes we don't see the connection. However, I mean, this was 2002. And the messages I kept getting, along with my other, political science graduates, was you're not going to be able to find a job. I had thought of going to law school, but at that time, you know, after 5 years of school, I couldn't bear the thought of going back for another 4 and then articling and not earning any money until I was in my early 30s. And so I thought this information science degree was very practical. Like I already had a lot of academic skills. I liked research. I never thought of myself as a business person, though you'll see from my career that I've worked in like some really hardcore industries. So I didn't really consider an MBA. And I would say at that time in 2001, MBAs weren't as popular as they have been in, you know, the last decade or so. And so information science felt comfortable to me. Like I like research, I'll learn about management, I'll learn about technology, it's interdisciplinary, I'll be able to get a job doing research. And that's exactly what happened. I did that degree. I focused on research and management, and I landed at PwC in a tax research role. So it was a very pragmatic choice that I made around employability at the time on understanding what would help me enter into the marketplace and be an attractive candidate. And then the second part of your question, can you remind me what it was, Ralph, please?
It's what kind of education you, or if you, if at all, received on the job, like within your work.
Yes, good question. Now, my answer to this question has a context, which is the economic context that we're in. So I'll answer this question in 2 parts: pre the Great Recession in 2008 and post the Great Recession in 2008. So pre the Great Recession in 2008, I worked for 3 years before that recession happened. I was inundated with learning opportunities on the job. It was fantastic. I was able to run, when I worked in the UK, I was able to run pilot programs. I was given money to run pilot programs. I was sent on courses in different cities. You know, when I moved back to Toronto from the UK, I used to go to the US to take training courses with Ernst & Young. You know, it was never a problem saying, oh, this is what I want to work on in my professional development. I want to take a leadership course. Post 2008, that all changed. So not all, but most of the substantive, impactful education that I've taken since 2008 has been at my own cost, which I highly advocate. And I think it's important to invest in your professional development. But, you know, even the policy studies that I did, you know, BMO has benefited directly from it, obviously. And I was obviously happy to share the expertise. They supported me with time, but I did the program on my own. But if we really think about on-the-job learning with that, coming back and saying to the bank, well, I have this expertise and knowledge now. How can I help you benefit from it? I was able to do a research project. I was able to run webinars, you know, seed ideas in the organization around this idea of a just transition to net zero carbon economy. So you will see the impacts on your job if you make the investment yourself. But we're not seeing the same kind of investment by companies in on-the-job learning. And, you know, you can get on-the-job learning through classes, and then you can also get on-the-job learning through projects and good coaching and mentoring. And coaching and mentoring continues to be available, obviously, and on-the-job projects continue to be available, but you need to put your hand up and ask for them, you know, as development opportunities. I typically don't find like people will tap you and say, I think you should always be letting people know what you're interested in doing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. A great point about sort of ongoing continuous learning, because learning doesn't just stop when you graduated, right? There's ongoing stuff, especially when you think about if you go into a profession like being a lawyer, social work, being a doctor, like there are expectations by the college or by the bar that you continue to engage in learning opportunities throughout your entire career. So a great point to sort of keep that in mind. Actually, on that note, in terms of the coaching and mentoring, I'm curious for you in terms of how do students get those opportunities? How do they network? How do they connect with those people that can provide that support? Because it can be pretty intimidating at times to reach out to people.
Yes.
Ask for help.
Yes. Okay. So the employee resource groups, which I mentioned earlier, are a great resource. You know, most mid to large size companies have these, and there are so many of them. Like We have at BMO 17 or 13, something like that, everything from persons with disabilities to ethnic minorities to women to intergenerational groups, multi-generational groups. So, you know, whatever your dimension of difference, you can find a group. And these groups are great because their job is to run these kinds of programs. So the easiest way to find out, you know, where there's a mentorship program or sponsorship program or coaching program is through groups like these. The other way is to have a conversation with your boss and make your expectations very clear about what you want. And is your boss able to give that to you? I mean, bosses vary in terms of their coaching capabilities. They don't all have, you know, good training. And maybe you don't want to be coached by your boss. Maybe that's not the relationship you want. So, I mean, but your boss is always there. And then you can approach people as well. Companies, more and more companies are setting up sponsorship and coaching and mentoring programs outside of these enterprise resource groups. Like these programs would be run out of human resources. And you can find out from your human resource business partner, for instance, what programs are available, what is the criteria for getting onto them. And for instance, at the bank, we have mentoring and career development programs for specific groups of people. So we have it for African Americans, we have it for Hispanic Latinos, we have it for Indigenous peoples. We have it for everyone, but I'm talking about very focused talent programs. And the reason we have this focus on certain programs is because we've looked at our data, and our data has shown us that these particular groups need more support to be able to progress in the organization. So, you know, likely if you go to work for a large organization or a mid-sized organization, this type of infrastructure will be in place to some degree. It's a matter of finding out where. Your first stop should be your boss and an enterprise resource group or an employee resource group.
Thank you. And this also touched on the point that you talked about before in like being your own self-advocate, that if you want to have these resources, making sure that other people know about it, that you're advocating for yourself as well. Because I find that for some people doing this kind of work, it's a lot of advocacy for other groups, for other people, but you also can't forget about yourself because you're also really important, because if you're not well, then how can you do that work as well? So
yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks.
I have another question to kind of hear your thoughts on, I guess I'm still forming it, but it's just a general question about the future of the economy and how I'm gathering you're providing this pragmatic advice for the kind of a conventional job setting. So I was wondering, in terms of like social sustainability and like the growth of the economy, where do you think entrepreneurialism kind of works into the mix? Is there a trajectory for entrepreneurialism to be more of a factor in economic growth? Or, yeah, just I wanted to field your general thoughts on that.
Yeah, so definitely entrepreneurialism is key. And one of my great disappointments, I don't know what Ralph, you and the others on the call think about this, but one of my great disappointments with the Canadian economy, so I moved here in 1996. My ancestry is British West Indian. My parents are from the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago. I was born in the UK. I just think we need more of an entrepreneurial spirit here. We need a more innovative mindset. We know our economy is driven by small and medium-sized enterprises. They are going to be, again, adversely, disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And it is a sector that needs to be looked at. Now, you know, there are many enabling factors that would have to be in place, regulatory frameworks being one of them, scale, right? We're a vast country with a relatively small population spread out and concentrated along the border. I mean, in Ontario, we have, you know, some tax incentives. I'm not familiar with the other provinces, but I'm sure we have them too. But this is a really like high impact area that needs more attention. Now, BMO is trying, as are the other Canadian banks, to promote this. We have a BMO for Women program, which is all about small and medium-sized enterprises that are run by women. We are introducing a focus on minority-owned, female-owned or led businesses as well to make capital available and other types of resources, what we call non-financial services, to try to kickstart this. The same thing in the Indigenous space. BMO has an Indigenous banking unit, and we're trying to continue to make capital available to private businesses, entrepreneurs in this area. Scotiabank has a big women's program. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, it is critical for our economy and for these companies to be able to scale up and have more of a global presence as well, not just be homegrown companies. Like when I was doing my research, I mean, I could go on and on about this. When I was doing my research on just transition, I mean, Canada was really lagging when it came to export of clean technology, right? So this seems to be a ripe space for entrepreneurialism, right? Who do we hear about? Elon Musk, right? He's like the only person you really hear about. But you have China, you have the US and Europe, and I believe India and Brazil, all leading Canada when it comes to entrepreneurialism in the clean technology space. Why is that? And is that only going to get worse for us now under a Biden administration? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
It's really informative. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in an answer to one of Jacqueline's earlier questions, you said that part of like the personal aspect of your role is fatigue, but that you've been working on resilience and you've been reading on that. I'm wondering what other things keep you motivated and keep you, happy.
Exercise.
Yeah.
Getting lots of exercise keeps me motivated and happy. Seeing friends. I mean, very simple things, the simple things of life, like seeing friends, being part of community, exercise. A big part of my life is meditation. And it's also been a big part of my leadership development, like building that self-awareness capability is very important. And that's a key part of that. And really trying to feed myself with information that creates a positive vision of the world. Again, I don't know, what everyone on this call thinks, but I think there has been such a predominance of irresponsible reporting through the pandemic across countries, not just in Canada, incorrect reporting of data, fear-mongering, misrepresentation of facts from reputed news sources. Okay, I read something in The Guardian. I like to see how different newspapers report on the lockdowns in different countries. The Guardian had the most sensationalistic approach to reporting on the Ontario lockdown. I had a friend write me and say, what's happened in Ontario? I heard you've gone back under lockdown. If you actually look at the changes that came in, they're not substantively different from what was put in place at the end of November. Anyway, so all of this is to say, choosing information that creates a positive vision of the future, like what I talked about with just transition. There is data that tells us that we are not going to have massive unemployment as we try to reduce emissions if we plan properly. Now that's a big if we plan properly. But I try to surround myself with that kind of information, like where is progress being made? What is a more hopeful future for society? That's important.
Oh,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And a great connection back to sort of information science masters as well, because that's all very well interconnected. So.
Well, I have a question for the attendees, if they're up for that.
I like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So the question is, like, when you think of diversity and inclusion, what is important to you? I'd love to hear from everyone, since we're a small, intimate group. What really matters to you when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work with like theater. I'm a drama major and I'm the equity director for the Vic Drama Society. So like, especially in my work in theater, it's important for me that, we are telling stories of racialized, underrepresented artists and, casting those people in those roles. And and yeah, also just making a space, even like backstage, because a lot of time I find like even in like mainstream media, people are like sharing these stories, but then all of the people on the production teams are, you know, white, or they don't identify with, you know, the group that the story is being told about. So I guess just like making sure that we're telling these stories, but that they're being told by, you know, the people that they're about.
Okay, great.
So for me as an anthropology student, where the term diversity has kind of taken on a bad connotation, like in contrast to multiculturalism. And that's basically the position, is that it kind of places it kind of raises the question, diverse from who? And it positions the sort of white privileged class to be the kind of normal group, and everything else is diverse from that. So in terms of like what's important on like the question, or like the topic of diversity and inclusion, is kind of a more reflexive note. Like, are the practices or solutions we're putting in place, or is the way that we're thinking about it still sort of internalizing this white normalcy? And like, is it kind of reinforcing or reperpetuating like this legacy of settler colonialism and chattel slavery? That's the kind of question that keeps being brought up in my courses. And I'm wondering to what degree that's acknowledged, or sort of a position that's being worked from at high level institutions, such as like diversity and inclusion sectors in the workforce.
Yeah, that is fascinating. So I completely agree with this framing that you offer. And it's just assumed in the corporate world that that is the position we should work from. If I think about the work we do around Indigenous peoples, or particularly this year with, you know, African Americans, and some of the programs, for sure, it reinforces this model of settler colonized. And I don't know when, you know, these bureaucratic sort of militaristic style organizations would be ready to embrace a different idea, because they're now getting their head around the impacts of colonialism. And I was surprised by how few people understood what those impacts were. Yeah. I'm going to take that thought back to work and see what the team thinks, like the D&I team, about that. That's very fascinating to explore.
For me, when I think about diversity and inclusion, mainly right now, what I've been thinking a lot about is in like the legal sector. And I've been watching a lot of the Supreme Court hearings. And what I see is, well, first of all, everyone on the Supreme Court is white. And then also almost every lawyer I see that is bringing a case to the Supreme Court, and the whole team is a team of white people. And when we think about like underrepresentation in like of minorities in the legal profession, but then also overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people and people with mental health disabilities, and the people that are being, I want to say, abused by the legal profession. For me, that's really important right now when I think about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. So Jim Kelly, are you talking about the Canadian Supreme Court?
Yeah, the Canadian Supreme Court, yeah.
Yeah.
Ronnie, you had mentioned several times about creating like a space where people feel psychologically safe. And I think in terms of diversity and inclusion, that would probably be like the most important factor for me, is just having everyone feeling comfortable to share how they feel, not like to any extreme extent, but
Mhm.
just to feel that when they share their views, that it is that it's a valid viewpoint and that it's safe to share this here, and that not only are you just sharing it, but we're going to actively together look for a solution. I think that would be probably like the pinnacle
Yeah.
that I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question in response. So imagine you entered the workplace. How would you know that what you just described was okay to do? What would be important to you? Like, what signal would tell you it's okay for me to speak up here and know that it will be received well, even if it's uncomfortable?
I think that people in higher levels of management, creating spaces to be vulnerable and taking the lead on that is very important. I used to work at Lululemon, and every time that there was a staff meeting, they would have, we'd sit in like a circle on the floor, and the first thing that they would do is something called vibes and, oh, what's the other one? I can't remember, but it's either you share something like that you're vibing off that's a good vibe, or something that is weighing on you and might be like a distraction. And we address that first as a group and offer support or celebrate together. And I think like just like small things like that, you know, having and it being like a regular practice, you know, not just like, oh, something tragic happened and now we're going to have this little like powwow together. Like, no, we should like constantly be, you know, engaging with each other and having these like vulnerable, open discussions. And I think having that initiative from like higher levels and it being a regular thing is a great way to know that you found that space.
Yeah. I think it's early days for most organizations, even those that would say they have a history with, you know, a long history with diversity and inclusion, multi-year, to get to what you're talking about, which is where it's part of I mean, ideally what you want is everyday practice, to have spaces where you can talk about how you're feeling and what's going on and how that might be related to, you know, dimensions of difference. Prior to, you know, the George Floyd killing this year, I would say it was more of what you talked about, which is like you have a powwow when there's a big world event, or, you know, when there was the shooting at the mosque, I think it was a shooting at the mosque in Quebec in like 2017, you know, then the team got together and, oh, how are you feeling, right? But between that incident happening and, you know, the terror attacks in France, nothing gets really discussed. So I think it's very early days, and I hope that the recognition, the attempts that are being made will, you know, become embedded over time.
Thank you so much. And that also hints at a sort of the workplace culture. Culture takes a long time to change. It doesn't change instantly, and that takes years, if not decades, for it to change, especially if you're thinking about a company culture, then also culture within industry and also within a sector, and that takes even longer to change. But it's great to see sort of things are shifting, and hopefully it will be, the momentum will continue to carry over. So I have one last question for you, Ronnie, in terms of what is one piece of advice that you would offer to the students here?
Read the news if you don't do that already, and critically assess it. But read the news from, you know, trustworthy sources. I mean, it sounds so trite, doesn't it? Because what happens in the world matters to business. And I think too often there's this disconnect. And if you can understand that dynamic between policy that's being set and how businesses are operating and how businesses influence policy, you're going to be set up for success. That is something I really see missing, and is, well, certainly the value of a political science education, but is the value of social sciences.
Thank you so much. Great advice in terms of being able to set that context, understanding the context and the impact of policy, because it impacts all of us at some level. And I don't think I've worked to express just how appreciative I am for all of your expertise and your knowledge and your wisdom. It's just been an hour of like just amazing discussion, both from yourself, but also learning from the students too. So it's sort of great two-way conversation. It's been amazing touching on the micro, the macro level of diversity and equity, talking about ourselves, but also talking about companies and our colleagues and also the government and the economy. We have covered a lot in the last hour. So thank you again for offering your time, offering your expertise, for giving back to the VIC community. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And then for the other students here, we do have one last panel for the series, Thinking Forward. It's on Tuesday at 4 p.m. and it's on environmental sustainability. So Ron touched on this briefly in terms of clean technology. So we'll be diving into a bit more about sort of net zero emissions, climate change in that panel where we have 3 VIC alumni talking about environmental sustainability. But thank you for joining us. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. And I look forward to talking to all of you soon.